Let's expand this conversation a little more now. Paul Gathitu is the spokesperson for the Kenya Wildlife Service, is with me in studio right here in Nairobi. Thank you for your time.
Asante.
What's your impression of the discussions coming out of the UN Environmental Assembly so far?
I don't think that it would have come at a better time, and particularly when you're looking at pollution, which has affected even wildlife. I think this is a very opportune time for the world to be discussing, and looking at the composition of the people who are there. It gives me a lot of confidence, that we will be able to come up with solutions. And I think the government of Kenya is to be commended, for just recently having introduced this ban on plastic papers. So coming on the heels of that, and then getting the whole world and people from so many spheres, whether they are architects or whether they are scientists or whether they are people in the economic world, all of them sitting and discussing pollution, and which has affected wildlife. Wildlife must be very happy.
But when we sit, okay, from my end of the space, right, when we talk about wildlife, we often tend to think of it in this isolated, nice little silo, right? So tourists come in, they pay money to see our wildlife. It's this asset that's out there somewhere, but we rarely think about the effect our actions have, especially in terms of pollution, on this asset. How bad is it? How much damage have we inflicted?
Yeah, I think it's quite significant, because when visitors go into the parks in particular, they will be carrying, before the ban, they would be carrying plastic papers and they leave them around. Wind would take these plastic papers from the surrounding communities, and the wildlife would be forgiven, of thinking that the tree has developed a new type of fruit, different color. And then they will go and attempt to have that. And remember, it's not just on the terrestrial, it's also in the marine, in the water bodies. So it's a fairly serious matter, and I think it's in very good time that we are now seeing that we need to take action. So we don't allow now people with plastic papers to go into the national parks since the ban. And working with the other collaborators, we have even been able to provide alternative carriers.
Should we expect a ban perhaps on these disposable one-use plastic bottles to come in the future as well?
Absolutely. I think it will be the next step, because the trouble, I think, with a lot of the Kenyans you will see is they are very quick to just toss out the plastic bottle for water. And every month you will see that we do cleaning of, say, the area around Nairobi National Park. And every quarter you will see that we are cleaning, in fact, even Mombasa Road, because of the two servos, and it's collecting all this litter and all this pollution.
But, I mean, that sounds like a massive operation, because, I mean, I'm thinking of Savo East, Savo West, Amboseli. Just those three combined. I mean, you could possibly take Nairobi and dunk it into one corner of those. These are enormous territories. How do you organize a litter cleaning operation on that scale?
Mainly we just go on the main road, because that's where the concentration of human populations would be. That's where the buses are passing, that's where the private vehicles are passing, and that's why they will toss out these papers. Yeah. We do not want then wildlife to come, elephants to come, buffaloes to come and start thinking that these plastics are food.
Right.
And that has been recorded, so it's a matter that we have to consistently do. But thanks to the law, people are now very conscious that if they are caught, dropping this, they would be in for trouble.
All right. I should also point out we're being joined from our studios in Washington, D.C. by Kari Fulton. She's an environmental justice consultant live in Washington, D.C. there. Kari, thank you for your time. Given the widespread economic, social damage that pollution, of course, does across several countries, it's usually not just a one-country affair. Is the law really up to speed to dealing with such transnational damage?
I think we have to really figure out a way to develop better strategies for transnational damage. And part of that does come from larger, bigger polluting countries like the United States really stepping up and realizing that we're not an island. We live on this planet together, and we have to build solutions together. So I really hope that we can develop a better strategy for that, and that also comes with how we deal with commerce and how we transport different things from one country to another, and the pollution that creates as well.
Right. Pollution, of course, has been the main focus of the Assembly, the United Nations Environmental Assembly this year. What needs to be done specifically to shift packaging, just to take one example, to shift packaging away from non-biodegradable plastics and into degradable, environmentally friendly alternatives?
Well, I think one thing is more people knowing that this is a viable solution, and then also a change in mentality. So a lot of times, especially here in Washington, D.C., our park services, they tested out taking away the straws, because straws are something that it's really hard to recycle. You really can't recycle it. So they took away the straws, and a lot of people were frustrated by that because they're so used to drinking with a straw. But you do have compostable straws that can be added into the marketplace. And if we add more of those options and we find ways that we can make those more affordable to produce, I think that's what's going to push the agenda to move forward with that.
All right, Paul, let me just come back to you very
also,
quickly.
Other strategies. Okay.
We do understand that there's plastic waste running around in parks, as you mentioned a little earlier, but how then does it end up in the food chain pretty much right across the board? Because we saw something similar with plastic waste getting into the food chain, because every time you take animals to the slaughterhouse, to the abattoirs, slice them open, and you'd find plastic waste is falling right out of them. Are we seeing something similar with the wild animals?
Yeah, you see, for the areas, particularly in the parks where you have picnic sites and things, baboons are very good. Because of course they are primates, so it means that whatever bins we put there, they are always thinking of ways of opening. Yeah. And the moment they open, they are looking for food, so they will disperse these papers around, and that means that now any other animal would be able to see. And as I said, you know, because of the neighbors that we have, the plastics will also be blown by the winds and sent into the park, onto the trees, onto the waterways. So you find that these plastics are finding their way through even flash floods. If you looked at Nakuru, for example, because of the design of the way the park is, it's on the lower end of the town. So it means that when there are flash floods, all that plastic is actually collected and now kind of sent to the park. So the treatment system needs to then be able to now get that, and that's the reason why it's very labor intensive, and we constantly have to keep removing, as I mentioned, you know, for Nairobi and for the park. And the same thing happens at the coast. You know, we have to have constant beach cleaning exercises, because again all this litter is brought and all these plastics. And when we are talking about pollution, it's not just the plastics, you know, we're also talking about effluent. Industries that are close to the protected areas, again they would be discharging this, and this needs to be constantly checked. We check even for the hotels that are around the parks, because again, if they discharge their raw material, it means that it's going to affect the waterways. So there's real danger, and I think working with them, we have been forced to constantly keep monitoring, so that we do not break the law or lower the standards. Right.
One last question, if I may, to you, Kari. I interrupted you just before we actually came to Paul here. At the end of the day, these biodegradable alternatives do exist, but why isn't there widespread adoption of them in the market, given that we know the damage that the plastic alternatives do?
Well, you have a lot of old money in dirty pollution. And that's the reality of it, is that there are industries that are not ready to completely turn over. They make a lot of money. They've found affordable ways to utilize petroleum and other products like that that are damaging to our environment. And they're not necessarily ready to switch over. So we have to have new industries and even existing industries that find the economic viability in building biodegradable products. And then having a market that says, okay, even if it's just a couple cents or a little bit more expensive, there's a long-term impact that we can really benefit from.
Should we move, perhaps nudge these old money and these old industries into that environmentally friendly future, perhaps, by levying higher taxes on them? Is that something that would work?
That would be the hope, that we could see higher taxes if it was something like that, but I don't even know if that is even necessarily the case. I think what really needs to happen is, if you have those higher taxes, then that might lead to a competitive force that moves and says, hey, we don't want to pay this, so let's move for that. So that is a possibility, but then there are people who get around those taxes, as we see a lot of times with other, like a carbon tax, where you have these false solutions. So we really want to figure out a way that we can build true solutions. If that means taxing some of those companies to get them on board, maybe that'll be helpful.
All right. Paul, coming back to you here in Nairobi. At the end of the day, though, we've covered the pollution side of it, but pollution is essentially linked very intricately to human settlement as well. Kenya's population obviously growing fairly quickly. Where does that human encroachment into wildlife sanctuaries then essentially act as a catalyst for pollution as well?
Fortunately for the case of Kenya, the protected areas are fairly intact. We don't have any cases of incursions in terms of people trying to occupy protected area lands. But we do have a challenge in the sense that wildlife is ecosystem based. So it means that even the areas that we've designated for protected areas are not enough to provide all the requirements of wildlife. And that means that they now move seasonally. So they migrate and they disperse into certain areas. Now that's where the challenge is, because now those particular areas would then have settlements, would have people who are very close, and the kind of practices that they put and the way they treat or manage the waste, and therefore increasing the level of pollution. Yeah. That's where the challenge is. So that's why the Ministry of Environment recently launched a report to try and map out the migratory and dispersal areas, to then now discuss with communities and see.
Right. So identify the problem, then figure out how to solve it.
Together.
Right, perfect.